commercial fishermen. I'm sure in your all's practice that you've seen a good many of these. And this was based on a study I did years ago. This thing isn't advanced. Let me try the computer here. This button?
Yes, sir.
There we go. And these are the people that helped me out with that study. David Griffith there on the second one, he's a professor of anthropology over on main campus. He's a brilliant guy, works a lot with migrant workers and different populations, and he helped with this study. He's written several books, and one book is called The Estuary's Gift, and if you have a special interest in that, it's a really good book with a good read. David Griffith is there. He's on main campus again. Christopher Scott and Eric Howell were both some of our early residents that helped me with the study. Larry McSwain and Drew there helped David Griffith with his part of the study. If you go around eastern North Carolina, it doesn't take long to realize that commercial fishing is a big deal around here. Just some of the pretty scenes of some of the fishing boats. And what we did is we went to festivals and fishing communities, and we offered free skin cancer screenings to anybody that came up to our booth. And when they came up, I'd ask them, what kind of work do you do? And if they said, I'm a commercial fisherman, we went into not only screened them, but also went into a little bit of a questionnaire to find out what kind of things they've been exposed to. We did our first year in North Carolina with a bunch of them. We tried to go to fishing shows when they were there. There's a big one in New Bern each year. And then we went to Maryland for the next year, and then the last year we went down to the Gulf Coast, down in Alabama and Apalachicola, Florida. These are some of the ones that we did. This is Chris Scott, I'm sorry, go back. David Griffith and Chris Scott at the Blessing of the Fleet in Hoboken. This is at the Oyster Festival in Mill Creek. That's Eric Howell there standing. This is at the North Carolina Fishing Show. We actually had the help of Jerry Schill, who was the president of the North Carolina Fisheries Association at the time, and also his wife, who was president of the North Carolina Fishing Auxiliary. And what we found out through them was that you've got to train not only the fishermen about health stuff, but you got to train the wives, because the wives are the biggest, have the biggest effect on the commercial fishermen doing things good for their health. This was at a Carteret County skin cancer screening where we had the help of Maurice Dana, who's a dermatologist in Newport, and Earl Gross, who's a dermatologist down in Morehead City. And then this was in Maryland at the East Coast Commercial Fishermen's and Aquaculture Trade Exposition. And whenever I did things out of state, I always got a licensed physician to work with us in the booth. And this here is Allison Ehrlich, who's on the faculty at George Washington University in the Department of Dermatology. And this is up in Graysonville, and Allison came with us to this one as well. My wife came to a lot of these. And this is at Tillman Island, the Crab Festival. And there's Allison Ehrlich again. This is my daughter and my wife, both helping out with the booth. And Eric is there, and Chris, both. And then we went down to the Gulf Coast. Blessing of the Fleet is the seafood capital in Bayou La Batre. And actually this lady here was the Surgeon General of the United States that was from 2009 to this past summer, actually. And this was Eric Howell that went with me down there. One of the things we realized there is that there was a huge Vietnamese population there, and they didn't come by our booth. There was a lot of problems between the two populations of commercial fishermen. The Vietnamese people were transplanted, of course, from Vietnam, and the federal government really helped them buy their fishing boats and all. And of course, they were in competition with the local fishermen, and there was really friction between them, a lot of friction. And this was the Florida Seafood Festival down in Apalachicola, and Chris Scott went with me to that. And so some of it was fun, but it was a lot of weekends away from here, I can tell you that. This is where the fishermen were in our study. We had some from the Roanoke Island area, 1 or two from the Outer Banks, some of them from just north of the Pamlico River estuary, a few from the south, some from around the Neuse River, and a whole bunch of them from the down east areas where most of them were from, a few from down around Wilmington. In the Maryland study, they were scattered pretty much all over, and we had a lot of them from this region here, some of them from all up down through Chesapeake Bay, and a few from down around Norfolk area. We call this the DELMARVA, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. And then for the Florida part of the study, this is right around Bayou La Batre near Mobile, Alabama. And then we had some around Apalachicola all the way over to Panama City. And it kind of moves us into the stuff we obtained from the study. When you look at the study population from North Carolina, Delmarva, and the Gulf Coast, all of them were about the same age on the average, around 50 years old. Males predominated. We had one female out of all the people we studied, and the rest were all male. So fishermen, a lot of people like to use the word fishers now, but there was only one woman in all the study. Time commitment, most of them were full-time, a few of them were part-time. Fishing locations, primarily inshore, was a kind of spread between them, 57% for North Carolina, 87% because of the Chesapeake Bay area of Delmarva. And Gulf Coast, it was kind of mixed, mostly offshore actually and inshore. And health insurance was kind of this may be a bit skewed because the people that came to one of the things we realized is when we were doing these studies, we'd look out on the water and some of the people were actually, the fishermen were out working in the boats. And so the people that we got coming to our screening in the festivals were people who could take time off, and so that may be a bit of a skewed deal here. But 60% of North Carolina fishermen, about almost close to 90% of the Delmarva people, and about 62% of the Gulf Coast people had health insurance. And most of them said, oh, I'm on my wife's insurance, because most of the time the wives would work. The phototype was also interesting. This is based on the 1 through 6, with 6 being very, very dark complected, 1 being almost no pigment. You know, the type 1 always burns, never tans, and those people, I think, selected themselves out just because they got sunburned all the time out fishing. Skin type 2 predominated in the North Carolina and the Delmarva group of people, and that's blue eyes, fair skin. They can tan, but they got to work at it, and I think that's the biggest risk factor for skin cancers, is that skin type. You know, the people with skin type 1 don't go out in the sun. They're the ones you see wrapped up under the umbrellas at the beach. Skin type 3 predominated actually in the Gulf Coast fishermen, so there was a little bit lower risk of skin cancer with that, even though they were in a more vertical sun area. Clinical data from the live screenings, we found a bunch of them had actinic keratoses, and that's no big surprise. Actinic cheilitis is the precursor for lip cancer, squamous cell carcinoma of the lip, and we picked up a few of those. Basal cell cancers were the predominant type that we picked up live screening the people, and they were primarily in the North Carolina and the Delmarva area. And the N number here for the Gulf Coast, again, was lower, but we didn't pick up any cancers in that group. Again, the skin type being a little darker complected for the most part. No melanomas were picked up on the live screenings. If you look at the historical data, many of them had actinic keratoses. Now, these are all that they had gone to a doctor for help with. So some of them would have them and not seek any medical care. Basal cell cancers were fairly common in the group. Squamous cell cancers were not uncommon. Malignant melanoma, there was an increase there as well. And again, this was all historical data. So the other things we picked up on the historical data, a lot of them had eczema, and of course their hands are in either rubber gloves or wet, dry, handling the lines and the nets and the sorting of the fish. And so there was a significant number of people with eczema, and most of it was hand eczema, according to the history. Superficial fungal infections, you know, you're out there and you're sweating and you're in rubber boots a lot of the time. And so the fungal infections, and again, these are all that people sought medical attention for. Bacterial infections, again, that they sought medical attention for were pretty high as well. The Gulf Coast, where it's warmer, had the highest percentage with about 70%. Traumatic injuries, this is something that we don't see as much in dermatology, but they go to the emergency room for, and was a fair number of that, and we'll see why in a minute. Bites and stings, a whole lot of those. I mean, if you think about sorting the bycatch, and there's all kind of fish with toxic spines, and of course stingrays being one that got them a lot. There was one commercial fisherman that said, he said, "Doc, I've been stung so many times by stingrays, I feel like a damn pincushion." Fish shocks, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's something that most fishermen have gotten involved with at some point or another. Heat stroke and frostbite, there were no cases of that in any of the populations. Potentially serious skin problems in the fishermen that we noted in the study. Of course, skin cancers were kind of the biggest thing we worried about. And there were some basal cells, squamous cells, malignant melanomas. Traumatic injuries, you know, if you look at the danger of fishing, mining, agriculture, and fishing are kind of your top three areas that lead to problems with even death. Stings, high number of stingray injuries. Man-o-war stings were more with the offshore fishermen in the North Carolina and the Delmarva area. And then they had bites, and the bites, the fish that they actually historically remembered to cause bites in them was shark, barracuda, bluefish, mackerel, and moray eel. Moray eels being more in the Florida area. So let's move on. We did surveys of licensed fishermen, and unfortunately the mailings were kind of a big failure. We only had 17.5% that answered back. You know, fishermen, I guess, are kind of like doctors. I don't do surveys. Interviewed fishermen from North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina landings were interviewed by some of the grad students working with David Griffith over on main campus. And again, the mean age was about the same as 43 here, a little bit younger. The average number of years fished was about 20 and ranged from 1 year to 65 years of fishing. And a few percentage, about 17% fish for less than 10 years. The protective gear from this survey, a lot of them were long sleeve shirts. It was about 50%. Even more, about 70% wore baseball caps. And the wide brim hat, which is what they should have been wearing, only about 19% admitted. A lot of them said, oh, it gets in the way of seeing where we're going and where the buoys and markers are. Gloves, about close to 90%. Again, that's working with the bycatch and all that they do, and of course, a lot of lines. Sunscreen, about 45% admitted to using it, and that, again, a lot of them said, my wife makes me do it. Long pants, about 74%, sunglasses, about 72%, and lip balm, about 38%. Where do they find out their information about health? Well, most of it's from friends and relatives, and you know how that can go in an uneducated population. Local TV news, some of them national TV, newspapers, local radio, magazines, National Public Radio, and HMO publications are all there, but the big source was friends and relatives, the wife. So let's look at a couple of these. These are actinic keratoses. They're precancerous. These are ones that we freeze, or we do some photodynamic therapy in our clinic for most of these. Only about 10% is what we tell patients go into a skin cancer over a lifetime. There was a recent study a few years ago that bore that out. So we do treat them, even though they're precancerous. The analogy of this is when a woman gets a pap smear, when it's dysplastic, then they get the cervix frozen usually. And this is the analogy. This is dysplasia of the epidermis. It can go into a basal cell. This is a commercial fisherman who had a big basal cell right by his eye, and that's, of course, right over the nasal lacrimal duct. And, that's going to be a big surgery. That was done with Mohs surgery. Wearing baseball caps leaves the ears exposed, and most of these guys had short hair, and their ears were under a lot of sun exposure. So it's squamous cell carcinomas very commonly on the ear. We saw a lot of actinic keratoses on the fishermen in that area. Melanomas and lentigo-malignant melanoma is the kind that comes from chronic sun exposure. Again, we didn't pick up any of these on our live screenings, but there was historical data of people not only having these, but knowing people that had them that were co-fishermen. You look at these fishing boats, and it doesn't take you much imagination to realize that skin trauma can be a big part of what they get into here. And you see a lot of winches and lines and trash all over the deck. This is a winch used to pull up crab pots, and you can get a finger caught in that or on the line. And the big winches that haul the big nets in. And again, most of the traumatic injuries end up in an emergency room, and we don't see those generally. This was a guy that did come to us, and he was a commercial fisherman from the Outer Banks. And the poor guy, every time he pulled nets in, he got blisters on his hand. And leaning up against the gunnel of the boat to pull the net in, he had blisters all over his knees. And this poor guy had epidermolysis bullosa acquisita with the workup. It's an autoimmune disease that causes blistering. And it's a very, very difficult one to treat. We ended up putting him on prednisone and Imuran and a whole bunch of other immunosuppressives, and we could not get him to clear up. And these people are very independent. They're very stoic. It takes a lot for them to come to a doctor, but this guy was really miserable with this. And I said, I'll support you for disability. He says, Doc, I don't need no damn disability. He says, I got to get back to work. And he went back to work with this. I mean, that's how stoic those people are. Traumatic injuries, these are some I got from off the net, but sometimes it's hook injuries, other times it's a boom coming down on a person. It's a variety of different injuries. Jellyfish stings. Jellyfish stings, a lot of times the jellyfish end up in a net, like you see here, and they raise that net up, and of course the fishermen are looking to see what they caught, and it comes down, and a lot of times the jellyfish stings are in the eyes. And that sounds horrible, and it is pretty painful, but it actually isn't really, really serious most of the time. They say what you do for that is you're supposed to use salt water to flush out, just the ambient seawater there to flush out the eyes, because if you use fresh water, it causes a massive discharge of the stinging cells and makes it worse. What some fishermen told me they used is they would carry a can of condensed milk, carnation condensed milk, and they'd pour that in the eye to relieve the pain. But generally it gets better in about a day or two, and you can have some sequelae from that with like glaucoma and corneal problems and such. The most dangerous of all these is, of course, the man-o-war around here, and there have been even fatalities due to a man-o-war with diving accidents and such. This is a stinging nettle from in the inshore areas, and the fishermen that are working in the inshore areas get stung by that. And that's not a real serious sting. It stings and bothers a person for about an hour. This here is a man-o-war sting, and you can see how bad that is. And the big thing about man-o-war stings and jellyfish stings is, again, you don't want to flush them with fresh water. You try to take a credit card and wipe away the tentacles and flush it with ambient seawater. Stingray injuries. You see the spine here on that stingray right there. And this is a close-up of the spine. It has grooves in it so that the toxin, the venom that's in it, actually flows down into the wound. And it has recurved teeth along the spine that you can see there that makes it difficult to pull it out. And most stings in North Carolina are from wading in the water. Of all the things we're talking about here, if I'm down at the beach, this is the one thing I worry about, because there's a significant number of these. And I've had faculty members call me when one of their kids steps on one, or even had a patient of mine that was from Bath that called me one day, and he had gotten one in Bath Creek. Now, where the fishermen get it more commonly is on the hands or the wrists, because they're doing the bycatch sorting, sorting out the good fish from the bad fish and the crabs and everything else, and so they're more commonly going to get it in the wrist area. What do you do for a stingray injury is hot water. Most of the marine venoms, whether it's fish, stingray, are very heat labile, and so they're in a marine environment that's cool most of the time, and so using real hot water will help to inactivate the venom, and so that's something that that people will use a lot of times. But this can lead also to secondary infection, which is another thing that can occur. Now, fish injuries are usually from spines, and they can be toxic, like this toadfish injury here. That's a venomous bite on that. Again, hot water is how you would treat that initially. Also have spines. This is from a pinfish. That's my finger. This is a surgeon fish here from a blade that comes out when you handle a surgeon fish. And this is from a mantis shrimp. Mantis shrimps have, they look like a shrimp, but they have this thing, almost modified legs that they can insert like a knife, or they can actually crush. And the commercial fishermen call them thumb busters, because they'll bust their thumb open and cause bleeding. And again, you worry about secondary infection with these. Fish bite injuries, this was a guy I was seeing in clinic for another reason. I said, "What's that on your finger?" So that's a flounder bite. And that's probably the most common thing of the mild ones, which they don't even seek medical care for. But of course you can get, like here, shark bite. This is a moray eel bite. And a lot of times recreational fishermen get it when they're taking the fish off the hook, or if they hold it up for the hero picture and it's not dead, it comes around and bites them on the rear end. Fish shocks. Commercial fishermen know about torpedo rays, which is this here. I was always taught in Florida when I grew up in Key West that we used to use wire leaders to keep the coral from cutting the line and some of the fish from cutting the line. And I was always taught, if you catch a round ray, don't pick it up by the wire leader, or you can get a pretty bad shock. And what the commercial fishermen do is, if they have a new mate that they put on the boat, and they're not real smart, they say, "Son, get that fish and put it up between your eyes." He said, "Make a wish and the wish will sure come true," you know. And the new mate will do that, and of course everybody's then laughing because it's about a 75-volt shock. It's not anything that's real dangerous, but it does ruin your day. And this is a stargazer, which is another one. These have electrocytes on the dorsal surface of them, and they can give a pretty good shock. The fishermen all know about those, and they learn it real quick, and then they avoid it after that. Infections in fishermen. This is erysipeloid, and this is one that is self-limited most of the time, and a lot of the fishermen think that's a fish toxin because it often comes after a fish spine injury or something like that, and it goes away after a couple of weeks. And so, you know, the fishermen will come in and say, "Doc, I got fish poison." It should be treated. It's erysipeloid, which is erysipelothrics ruseopathy, and the reason it should be treated, even though it goes away most of the time, is that it can occasionally get into the bloodstream, and it goes to the heart, causes endocarditis, and that has about a 38% mortality. The only thing about that one is it's vancomycin resistant, the one thing you have to learn, but otherwise it responds to penicillin, the cephalosporins, usual things that erysipelas responds to. This here was a guy pinched by a crab on his arm. He was a dialysis patient, so he's immunosuppressed, and this is Vibrio vulnificus. It goes very quickly to septic shock and to blistering, and that's a clue that you're dealing with that. And that carries about a 40 to 70% mortality, even if you recognize what it is and treat it with the right antibiotics. Ceftazidime and doxycycline are usually used. This is another case here of Vibrio vulnificus. That was a commercial fisherman who bumped his shin on the air conditioner on his boat, and that guy lived, the other one died. This was a guy who was a commercial fisherman who wore rubber boots all the time, and the boots got wet inside, and he didn't let them dry out in between the fishing trips, and that cultured out Pseudomonas, and that's a fairly common one. The most common ones are going to be the same ones you get on land, staph or strep, and this is a good example here. This was a guy that was spined by a red drum when he was cleaning it, and it was fluctuant. We opened it up, and it had gram-positive cocci in it, so that was just Staphylococcus. Nowadays we culture it to rule out MRSA, but most of the time it's just a regular methicillin-sensitive staph. Conclusions from this study. There's a large variety of cutaneous problems related to the occupation of commercial fishing. There's a variability of skin problems depending on where the person is fishing. If they're offshore, there's more likely to have a man-o-war sting. If they're inshore, it's more commonly to get the stingray injuries. Unique healthcare needs are in commercial fishermen, and there's a need for affordable health and disability insurance. Well, of course, we have the Affordable Care Act now to take care of all this. Sun protection needs, that's a big deal with commercial fishermen. Of course, they sweat a lot, so they have to reapply it pretty frequently, and of course that gets expensive, and a lot of these guys are barely making ends meet now. The whole field of commercial fishing is dying. Some of you guys may have had tilapia when you were kids, but I never heard of tilapia until recent years, and that's because it's an aquaculture fish that comes from overseas. 95% of all the shrimp that we eat in this country now comes from overseas. So this is very much a dying industry. The cost of diesel fuel has gone way, way up. The fishing regulations from North Carolina within the state and also from the federal, I heard person after person complain about them, and yet they're needed. And yet it's putting them out of business, and it's not going to be much longer before we don't have it. Texas, with their commercial fishing, put in real restrictive laws, and that whole field of commercial fishing in Texas died pretty much overnight. Ours has been slowly dying over years, and it's becoming less and less. Better access to medical care. A lot of these people are in little tiny fishing communities where they don't even have an ER. So they have to be taken to places and see the local medical doctor. Protective gear and equipment for a fisherman is needed, and there needs to be a more global approach to fishing safety at sea. There are things that probably they should carry on board as first aid, and yet most of them don't. We did, with the help of Sea Grant, some educational brochures to give to not only the fishing communities, but the North Carolina Fishing Auxiliary and the North Carolina Fishermen's Association. These were printed up by Sea Grant and the Coast Watch people and distributed, and even the seafood houses, they gave these. And we came up with posters to put around. These were put on some of the docks around eastern North Carolina. Also the seafood houses. A lot of these diseases we talked about as far as infections, you can get actually, cleaning the fish and shellfish and such. And I'd like to thank NIOSH for supporting this research that we did. Sea Grant was a big help with some of the educational efforts that we did. And all of this was done under the North Carolina Agri-Medicine Institute. And so we had a lot of help from them as well. People ask me why we did this study. Well, this is a good reason right here. That's me and Eric there, and that's one of the girls at the BioLabatra Blessing of the Fleet. Are there any questions?
Bill, you said to put a metal war jellyfish to put salt water.
Right.
And for the other fish things, you said hot water.
Right. Yeah, hot water is hot fresh water is fine for all injuries, and if you could get hot salt water, that'd be the perfect thing to flush the area with, but most people don't have access to that. You're out in a boat, you're on the beach, and what you have a lot of is ocean water. The one thing you don't want to do is to use fresh water. If you use fresh...
Salinity is the deal with jellyfish that come in.
It is, yeah. It's what happens is if you have a change in osmotic pressure, all of the nematocysts, the stinging cells, fire, and you can take somebody who's doing pretty well and has a mild sting and make it a real bad sting. You don't do it right.
And how long should you put that on?
It's just enough to kind of flush it, and then you take a credit card or a knife blade and wipe the tentacles away.
So you don't need to put it.
No. It's just to kind of flush the area. And then flush it again after you've taken the tentacles off. And again, if you have hot water, that's great, hot seawater. But most people don't have that. And again, even if it's a jellyfish sting in the eye, that's what you do is the ambient seawater. I've seen all kind of stuff. Some people say use sterile medical saline. Where are you going to get that on a boat, on the beach, And I've seen other things. Some people just say get fresh water and flush it out, but I think that's stupid because, again, if there's tentacles still there, they're going to fire. So, any other questions? Let you guys leave early today.
sir.
Yes.
I appreciate that.